I guess the microphone works. Good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for this presentation on the Eastern Academic Scholars Trust, or EAST project. I'm Susan Stearns. I'm the Executive Director of the Boston Library Consortium, but today I'm wearing my EAST Project Director hat, or jacket. Joining me on the panel today are Matt Barnes from OCLC's Sustainable Collection Services. Matt's going to talk about the work that we really have just about completed over the course of the last year plus, working with SCS on the collection analysis for EAST. And following Matt will be Lori Huddy. Lori's from the CTW Consortium in Connecticut, and Lori's going to talk about the results of that collection analysis and the process of modeling and concluding retention commitments for EAST. I'll come back briefly then and talk a little bit about some of the validation work that we've done for EAST. And summing it all up will be Matthew Sheehy from Brandeis University, who'll talk a little bit about the potential impact that EAST and other shared print initiatives may have on resource sharing, collection development, and our lives. Make sure I can advance the slides here. So the Eastern Academic Scholars Trust, which I'm going to now call EAST, so I don't have that mouthful for the rest of this presentation, is a collaboration of 48 academic and research libraries from Maine to Maryland today, who are collaborating on protecting the Monographs scholarly print record. We do have plans in the future to focus on serials and journals, but the work that we've done to date is exclusively around monographs, so that's what we'll be talking about today. Those 48 libraries include 40 retention partners. Retention partners in EAST agree to participate in the large-scale collection analysis that we've completed and that you'll hear a little bit more about. And then based on the retention model that is agreed to, they further agree to commit to retain in their local collections the retained titles and make them available to other EAST partners through standard interlibrary loan. I'm going to quickly review some of the major milestones that we've accomplished since we kicked off the EAST project in June of 2015, so just about 16 months ago. The primary focus has been the collection analysis, and again, I'm not going to spend much time on that. I'll let Matt and Lori focus on some of the details of that, but just suffice it to say that as part of that, we created a collective EAST shared print collection of over 16 million holdings to analyze as part of the collection analysis. The result of that was developing retention commitments for just over 6 million holdings across the 40 EAST member libraries. We also did a sample validation study. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a few minutes, which resulted in determining a 97% availability expected of retention titles across the 40 participating retention libraries. We just completed finalization of our Memorandum of Understanding and other major operating policies, and that MOU is now out for signature with the EAST members. We're working with our EAST members on the important work of disclosing retention commitments in their local catalogs, and once tools are available, hope to do the same in WorldCat. And finally, we have begun to undertake discussions with others engaged in shared print initiatives around potential collaborative work in the future. I want to spend just a moment talking about the EAST business model. From the outset, sustainability has been an important goal of EAST, and although much of our work to date and into the next year has been grant funded and will continue to be grant funded for at least some number of months, it has been important that we ensure long-term sustainability for EAST. And these are the three components of the business model. Each of the EAST members, both the retention partners and those that we call supporting partners pay annual member fees. Those membership fees support the staffing of East, a level of administration, potentially any work that we may do to solicit future grant funding, and also we have been able for the first couple of years of East to set aside a small portion of those membership fees for future collection analyses in the hopes of bringing new libraries into East. The grant funding that we have, and there are two major grant funders for East, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Davis Educational Foundation. Their monies have contributed to the kind of organizational development of East. 70% of the monies that we have spent on collection analysis have been grant funded. 100% of the work that we've done on validation sampling has been funded, in this case by Mellon, and we've also been able, from the Davis monies, to set aside additional monies for future collection analysis in the hopes, again, of being able to grow the East membership. And then finally, those members who have participated in the collection analysis in this first cohort of libraries have also made a contribution to that collection analysis, about 30% of the total cost. It's only November 3rd, 4th, whatever today is. One always loses track of time at these conferences. But anyway, it's only early November, so we still have some work to be done for the remainder of 2016. And I've listed some of the major projects here. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but let me focus on a couple. We are in the process, as I think I mentioned earlier, of doing initial planning on the serials and journals side for East. Luckily, SCS has just begun to work on some potential tools that might facilitate a more formal collection analysis, but nevertheless, we'll start our planning now and see where that goes. And then we're also doing outreach to potential libraries interested in joining East for Cohort 2, which we hope to put in place in early 2017 and begin a second collection analysis with that cohort in the spring, summer of next year. If you're interested, stop by and let me know. I would also draw your attention to the East website, the URL of which is listed here, and there's much more information about the East project than we're going to be able to go into in the time that we have today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Susan. When SCS was founded in 2011, it was partly due to a shift that was taking place in the library space planning conversation. At the time, there was a lot of discussion about how much stuff can we possibly fit into this library, and that was beginning to shift into a discussion about what kind of learning experience do we want to facilitate in this library. However, making that transition from stacks that are full of books, but not necessarily full of patrons, to space that features digital commons and innovation labs and collaborative learning spaces. And did anybody go to the Charleston Fast Pitch session this morning? One of the winners was an entrepreneurial center called, what was it called? It was called, yeah, and it's basically featured in the library for all of those undergraduate students who are now expected to create their first company before graduation, apparently. And that's the sort of spaces that we're seeing people want to develop. But again, making that transition can be quite tough, moving from storage to innovative spaces. The reason it was tough is oftentimes the data to make decisions about the collections is scattered, it's dirty. In 2011, when SCS was founded, there weren't any dedicated decision support systems to help facilitate that task. And there's still a real threat that widespread, uncoordinated deselection could lead to real harm to the scholarly record. So SCS's solution to this was to create an ecosystem that includes human-supervised data cleaning and data connecting, intuitive decision support with green glass, which I'll talk about more in just a moment, and consultative liaison support. All of this is designed to help libraries build retention and deselection programs. In 2015, SCS was acquired by OCLC, and this provided the resources and data assets necessary to build group-specific functionality in Green Glass. What this allows is large numbers of libraries to come together, as East has, to create collaborative and coordinated retention and deselection programs for monographs. Today, SCS has worked with roughly 250 libraries in both individual and group projects. This has led to millions of retention commitments and hundreds of thousands of deselection commitments that were informed and did not hurt the scholarly record. At the center of SCS's solution is Greenglass. That is our web-based decision support system, which you'll be hearing about quite a bit, I think, in this presentation. It's really designed to take an enormous amount of collection data and present it in an intuitive and visual way. The real magic behind Greenglass is it takes data from your local systems, connects it with external data sets, and allows you to create any number of scenarios to build a data-driven retention and deselection program. No SQL skills, no programming skills necessary. Anyone can run these scenarios. And in the group context, with the group functionality I mentioned, it allows a group to determine the impact of any given scenario on every library in a group real time based on any change to the particular model you're working on. Now, it is important to mention that even the best, most intuitively designed decision support system isn't going to do a whole lot for you if the data it is using happens to be dirty or incomplete. And that's why SCS spends an enormous amount of time cleaning the local data from your systems, which includes normalization, filtering, augmenting those records to get them ready to be matched to a number of external sources, such as HathiTrust, Choice, and WorldCat. The reason this is important is because those external data sources actually provide a great deal of context to your local collection. Probably the best example here, most intuitive example, are WorldCat holdings. For every item that we pull from your system and clean up, we'll let you know as a default how many other libraries in the US hold that particular item, either any edition of the work or the specific edition of the title you're looking at. We also look at that in a state context, but perhaps most intuitively, and something we'll talk about here more, is libraries are also able to name other groups of libraries that they wish to have holdings overlap compared to. This might be ILL partners, consortia, peer libraries, whatever your imagination or your goals might believe is necessary. And all of those can be pulled into the models and scenarios that you build in order to design your program. For instance, in East, there were four major four major comparator groups, as we call them. Regional large academic libraries with 94 symbols, this was the biggest group. Regional college libraries, the main shared collections, and Connect New York, where a project had already taken place. Lori's going to talk about how these comparator groups played into the thinking, the strategy, and eventually the models that were created by East to create their program. Once all this comes together, the data, the comparator groups, Greenglass group functionality allows groups to understand their collection in terms of overlap, subject dispersion among all of the libraries, and aggregated usage. This allows a lot of experimentations using a model builder. This can be particularly important in a group context where you're going to get a lot of ideas coming from a lot of different constituencies. With Greenglass, you're able to quickly test these ideas and provide and figure out the quantitative results of any given idea. This helps generate buy-in and consensus, and eventually commitments that can be made in confidence in terms of retentions for various monographs. I should mention that the philosophy upon which group functionality was built is retention first. And what I mean by this is Greenglass first looks to establish a safety net based on the model and rules that have been decided upon by that group. That allows security for scarcely held items. It helps make sure that high demand items are going to be available for users, and we also equitably distribute the retention commitments across groups. And only at that point do we believe deselection should take place. A quick example at a general level will help pull this together. If I'm a consortia and I want to make sure that my group maintains access to any title that's held by less than 100 libraries in the United States, I can do this in a few clicks within the model builder. I simply, you notice that retention is one of the first items on the screen. I ask Green Glass to retain one item whenever there are fewer than 100 holdings in the U.S. All point and click. I could add other factors. We'll keep this simple. And what Green Glass will do is generate a diagram that shows the necessary retention commitments for each library, represented by dots, in terms of the percentage of their collection, which is on the y-axis. You can see in this case, in order to implement that rule, 19% on average would need to be retained by every library. Some are a little less and some are a little more based on their specific collection makeup, but you can see the impact. If I shifted the rules, added additional criteria, this would shift automatically, showing you the impact of that particular decision. And on that note, I'll hand it over to Lori, who will talk about how this was used specifically in East to design their program.
Thanks, Matt. Let's see. So I'm Lorraine Huddy with the CTW Library Consortium in the state of Connecticut. We consist of 3 small libraries, Connecticut College, Trinity College, and Wesleyan University. And I'm their collaborative project librarian. And much of my work focuses on collection practices across the consortium. So when the 3 libraries joined East as retention partners, it made sense for me to volunteer to be on the East Monographic Working Group. And I also ended up serving on the collection analysis and policy subgroups. So the East retention model's primary components focused on retaining a copy of all existing holdings of titles that were scarcely held, and retention up to 5 holdings for titles that had significant use across East, and then retention of 1 holding of each title that fell out of those 2 criteria. And there were 2 major exclusions: recently published titles and ephemera. I'm going to tilt this a little so I can see people. So the ephemera were what we described as holdings with limited scholarly value, things like prep books, computer manuals, travel guides, that type of thing. Things that the collection analysis group decided that had limited academic scholarly value and that we wouldn't want to retain for the 15 years of the East commitment. So we actually borrowed the main shared print collections group. They had created a list of publishers, and we expanded upon that. And we were able, actually, I should say, SCS was able to flag these publishers within Green Glass and automatically exclude them from the East retention holdings. And the result was that approximately 1% of all the East members' holdings were flagged as ephemera and excluded. So this ended up being our final retention model, again, focusing on the scarcely held, widely used, and the final retain all parameter. We went through 3 model cycles, and we got a lot of feedback from the members during the process. All the model cycles excluded ephemera, like I just mentioned, and the recently published titles that were excluded were those published from 2011 and forward. We focused on the most current 5 years publication dates, figuring that none of the academic libraries would want to get rid of those titles at this time. So the scarcely held items that were items held by fewer than 5 East members, we originally thought that we would hold a single copy of any item held by fewer than 25 libraries in the US, but that was increased to 40 libraries for the final model. And anything that was held by fewer than 5 ARLs in the East region. And we use those comparator partners that Matt described to figure out the holdings by all those other libraries. We also were able to use the Connect New York retention partners holdings from Adelphi, Bard, Hamilton Union, and Vassar. So anything not already being retained by the Connect New York East members, we excluded, or I'm sorry, we did not retain anything held by them. So we did remove a couple scarcely held parameters. So we did have Maine shared print set up as one of our comparator groups, but only Colby College ended up joining East in the long run. So we did have to take them out of the comparison groups because we didn't have an agreement between East and the Maine shared print project. And we also decided not to focus on titles and Huddy Trust because many East partners were not Huddy Trust members. So then the widely used titles, we decided we would retain 5 copies. We started out thinking that 10 aggregate uses across East would be enough, but our members told us that we really needed to increase that, and the final aggregate uses was 30 or more. And then for the retain all, it was one single copy of all other holdings that the East members had in their collections that were neither scarcely held nor widely used. So excluding such titles was deemed detrimental to East's purpose as a light archive of the scholarly record. And actually, this came to a surprise to the collection analysis group because we figured the East members might want to exclude the retain all because it did boost the final retention level quite a bit. So here's a screenshot. I forgot to. So here's a screenshot of what that proposed final retention model looked like. Green glass actually equalizes retention holdings across all the participating members so that everyone is holding an equalized level of their collection on behalf of the East partnership. The one outlier, which is, the one outlier is at the end here, and that's the 5 colleges, and that was because of it's actually the 5 colleges repository, and because of the high level of unique content, they actually ended up holding about 39%, where the average was 36%. But the actual final retention allocations ended up being this. The 5 colleges repository ended up saying that they would retain 92% of their collection on behalf of East, and UMass Amherst, which has a huge collection of about 1.2 million holdings, they said that they would retain 90%, which really dropped the final retention model quite a bit. And also Yeshiva University said that volunteered to hold 59% because of their unique holdings of Judaica material. So instead of the 36%, the actual level ended up being between 28 and 30% for all other East retention partners. So this is the screen that we see now, the CTW libraries can see now by going into Green Glass. There's this really nice page that has the metrics and allocations, and we can see how our retention commitments and our holdings compare both against these comparator groups and also compared to all other sustainable collection services clients. That's on the right side of the screen there. So we really enjoy seeing how this worked out. And at the very bottom here, it shows what was allocated to this particular library. In this case, it was Connecticut College with about 120,000 volumes. And we click on that link and we go to this really nice display showing how our collection, the holdings that were sent to East, the green is what we were allocated for retention, the black is what was not. And we can use these items on the right or on the left side that Matt pointed out where we can focus in on certain aspects of the collection like language, publication date, a bunch of different things, and then you can create these queries and save them. And one of the ways that CTW did this was for special collections. The special collection librarians wanted to know what was being held for commitment for East in terms of publication materials before 1900 and before 1851. So they were curious, is there anything there that really should be in special collections or might require special handling when it's sent over to another East library? So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Susan, and she's going to talk about the validation study.
Thanks very much, Lori. Yeah, one of the most important and in many ways unique aspects of the East project to date has been our approach to validation. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of validation in shared print, it can be used in different ways. It can mean determining the likelihood that a given item that is expected to be on the shelf is in fact there and hence available to be shared. And that was our primary approach with East. Validation can also mean comparing the physical item to the metadata, the descriptive information in the library catalog. And finally, validation can relate specifically to the condition of a given item. We had originally expected that just because of the size and scale of East, we would not be able to do any kind of condition validation or verification, but we were able, as a result primarily of the hard work of our validation working group, to include a cursory check of condition as materials were located on the shelf for the sample validation study. So this was our goal, to sample a statistically significant number of items across the 40 East retention partners and determine presence of items, hence providing some further assurance to the various stakeholders of East that shared print materials would be available for sharing and hopefully in usable condition. I mentioned earlier the validation working group. This was a group that worked very closely with the East project team, particularly our data librarian, Sarah Amato, in rolling out the validation sample study. We also had a statistical consultant who's actually from the Heller School at Brandeis, who assisted us in defining the sample size for East and reviewed the methodology. As a result of our determination that we wanted a 1% accuracy rate, and with the assumption that the missing rate was likely not to exceed 10% across any of the 40 libraries, we needed a sample size of 6,000 titles for each of the 40 libraries. So we actually sampled 240,000 items and worked with SCS to develop a random sample drawn from each of the library's data extracts. Our data librarian, Sarah Amato, developed a data collection tool that would allow the workers to doing the data collection to go directly to the shelves, scan barcodes, have the actual presence or non-presence of an item recorded, and then to do the cursory condition check that you see here. Sarah has made all of the code for that data validation, data collection tool, as well as all of the documentation that we developed to facilitate training of the workers, available on GitHub. And that URL is provided here. We would encourage other libraries that might be considering some form of validation to take a look at this, and would be more than glad to talk a little bit in more detail about our experience and what we would do a little bit differently if we did it again. So here's a picture of two students. These are actually students at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst using the data collection tool to check the shelves. Prior to actually going to the shelves, we worked with each of the libraries to do an automated check of their local ILSs so that the items that were actually loaded into the data collection tool were known or were expected not to be in circulation, missing, or otherwise unavailable. So the expectation was that all of the materials that were to be checked should in fact have been on the shelf. The results of this were a 97% availability across the 40 libraries, so 3% of the materials that were expected to be there were in fact missing. And of the materials that were found on the shelves, 90% of those were in average or better condition. We had a 3-point scale that was excellent, average, and poor. We're in the process now of doing some further data analysis. By we, I mean primarily our statistical consultant. We had originally thought that this kind of second validation phase would focus on looking at whether or not maintaining additional copies of a given title would increase the likelihood that a usable copy would be made available to an East member. But based on our analysis of the initial data set, redundancy of copies did not seem to be the primary determinant of likelihood of a usable copy being available. The two things that stuck out initially were that materials that were published pre-1900 were in statistically significant poorer condition. I think there were about 45% more likely to be in poor condition than materials that were published post-1900. And the other thing that stuck out is that widely circulated items were slightly more likely to be unaccounted for. Now, neither of these are terribly surprising, statistical conclusions, but it did make us decide to really do a deep dive into the data and take a look at trying to answer some further questions and hopefully making more contributions to future shared print projects. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew for some final thoughts. Mr. Sheehy.
Hi, how are you? So I really am lucky because the picture that was painted of East is a photograph, and it's been done really well by the people up here. So I've been blessed with the opportunity to, rather than give you a photograph of what this project is about, I'm going to start with the Jackson Pollock, and I'm just going to throw out a lot of ideas. I'm really leery about presentations where all I do is ask questions, because that's not why you came here, right? You came here for answers. But I'm hoping in the end that they'll sort of resolve itself into more of a Rothko. So there'll be some loose edges that still won't be defined, but at least we'll have a little bit more understanding of what's going on. So for me, when I think about the projects of East, I really think about the Holy Grail of these shared print projects, and I believe that's the collective collection. We heard Jim Neal talk about it this morning, or yesterday, or whichever day it was, that we really have to start thinking a lot more collaboratively. We can't do this alone. No library is going to be able to do this alone moving forward. The one piece I want to read to you, and I apologize for reading it, is from a 2009 Harvard report from the Task Force on University Libraries. It says that the Harvard libraries can no longer harbor delusions of being a completely comprehensive collection, but instead must develop their holdings more strategically. Harvard understands that it just can't have everything. We have to have partners. We have to work together. So what's that going to mean? Well, it's going to mean we're going to need data. We're going to have to figure these things out. So when I think about data, I love the movie Contact. Well, I love Jodie Foster because she looks a lot like my wife does. But I also love the movie Contact because my favorite scene from that movie is where Jodie Foster, or Ellie, sitting on top of a mountaintop, and the evil drummer, the PI for the big project, comes up and says, "How can I go back and say there's this crazy woman listening to washing machines out in the middle of the desert spending these millions of dollars?" And she says, "Well, I'm listening for patterns." And I think what a lot of these projects are doing are creating really big data where we can begin to see patterns. Now, I know you have to be cautious. You don't collect data so that you can find questions to ask. That's one of the traps we all fall into. But rather, really, you can begin to see patterns developing, and it's some of the things that I think that has been helpful with this project. The other piece that I sort of think a little bit about when I'm thinking about this is, or at least I'm pretty confident in the time that I've spent listening to the washing machines in my office, is that there are patterns that are developing. I'm looking at interlibrary loan patterns that are happening. I'm looking at what we're borrowing from other institutions and being able to hold that data against the really fine data that SCS has been able to provide us. We're beginning to see collection strengths. And we're not at the point, I think, of really being able to develop that model yet, or at least I'm not at that point, but I do think that's one of the places that these projects can go, and that's one of the reasons I'm really excited about it. The next thing I think about when I'm thinking about these projects is there's a lot of changes in resources that we're going to have to start to think about. Now, the new skills for our employees. So we have bibliographers. Now, do we need statisticians instead of bibliographers because we now need to analyze this data? I mean, what kind of skills are we developing? Do we need data collection management people, or do we need logistics people? Because it's no longer about getting the book on the shelf. It's about moving a book across a state or across a country or wherever it needs to be. So how are we redefining the workforce of the library? So I think that a lot of these projects do have implications that step a little bit beyond what we're thinking about. I think a lot about the special collections. I have this idea that university libraries, research university libraries, have sort of a three-legged approach to collection development. One is that we definitely support the curriculum and we buy what's needed for what's currently going on campus, the teaching and the learning. There's no question about that. We also have to rely on our partnerships, which is what we're talking about, these shared partnerships, and I think they're unique, they're very important. And then lastly, what differentiates my library from your library is that we have different, unique, and special materials. And what I see here is that we're going to maybe start to count on these shared collections a lot. And we're going to start weeding our collections a lot. And so what happens when we start to do that? I mean, is there such a thing as altruism? If we all become net borrowers, what happens? Who's actually collecting this material and who's keeping this material moving forward? Another reason that these projects are so important, and it's so important that these retention commitments are stored, that they're visible, and that we can continue to collect at that level. The other thing about this is that there's a lot of business opportunities out here, because again, libraries can't do it alone. And there's no reason that we have to. We do have the fortune of having places like SCS to turn to for data analysis. But what about other things that we might envision for what we're calling general collections? There could be other services that could pop up, right? So we have already some pretty impressive storage facilities. So Jake Nadal's not here right now, but what would stop RECAP from being the place where we look to have our secondary and tertiary materials stored so we can focus on unique material in smaller libraries? And in smaller libraries, we can focus on our material that's supporting the academic curriculum at that time. And we can begin to count on them and support them and build a model that they can then use to support and sustain their operations. Is this an operation also where we might think of a company that's not a not-for-profit? So maybe like a McNaughton that does fiction, we can have that sort of develop a leasing program. Is that an opportunity that's out there? I don't know. I'm not a businessman. That's why I'm a librarian. But there's also opportunities for logistics and storage, and could this be something that real for-profit companies embrace? So Iron Mountain or Myers, what about them being a distribution hub and thinking about how they can involve themselves in this ecosphere of retention and storage? I'm not sure I know the answer, but it's certainly things I think about. And I think that just because they're for-profit companies, they're that's not enough reason to turn away from these ideas. I think we have to continue to welcome them. So what I'd like to, I'd like to just say that I think a lot of these people are our partners. UPS can be our partner. We can partner with Iron Mountain. We can think about SCS as a place that we're spending a tremendous amount of money. Of course, I can't say anything too positive without, I'm a Gemini, by the way. I don't know if I've said that yet. So I can't say anything too positive without considering the other side of it, and have we done the economics of this? Is it really affordable to continue to rely on these for-profit companies? And again, I have no problem with for-profit companies and libraries. We need to make sure that the economics work for us. And I believe that a lot of work is being done in East as a pilot to show that it really is feasible, and it is something that we can move forward on. The last piece that I have to talk about, now that I've got my 1-minute warning, is the effects of scholarship. So one thing about these projects that worry me is that we count things, right? We do iPads, we do ACRL, we do ARL. We're trying to define how we count things, what it means. ARL is saying it's not about your collection size, it's about the services you provide. It's about your collection size with ARL. You know, a community college is not getting into ARL. It's really about a big collection. So we do, anything that we count is going to be ranked. So we have to think about how that fits in our world. We have to think about how this affects the various different disciplines that we're working in. So we have liberal arts that are looking towards the long form. So that seems to work. We want to retain books for them to be able to use them. You might say, well, STEM, who cares, right? They're just going to go to the current journals. We don't need to do that until you have a history of science program. And you say, oh, crap, I just threw all that stuff away. And now I have to turn to someone else to be able to support that program. And then, who does it affect? For me, it's when you can't get that material, you can't browse that material, the serendipity is lost. Now, I'm not one of those people who believes that browsing the shelves brings serendipity. When you browse the shelves, the best content's probably checked out already, right? So it doesn't always work to browse the shelves. But we're searching, and we're doing discovery in very different ways. I'm thinking about our current faculty, and when I talk to faculty, I actually heard recently that faculty is just as guilty of finding the easiest way to get content than a non-faculty person. I was told once when I found out we did a citation study and we have a fantastic result from our library about the amount of material that we can supply to a faculty member to support their scholarship. I was speaking to the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and she said, of course you do, because what you don't have, we don't include in our bibliography, unless we have to, and then we go at it. We find an article that's similar. So they're doing the exact same thing that the students are doing. They're doing it much more thoughtfully, and I love our faculty, and it's not a negative statement about them. But they are doing the very same kind of things. Our current students are beginning to expect things. We read this in the literature all the time, right? We say that we're going to have our students expect material much, much faster to their desktop. But what I'm finding as a father of teenage kids is we ain't seen nothing yet. My kids expect it before they even want it. They don't even know what they're looking for, they're expecting it. So we haven't, in my judgment, began to think about content delivery. And I wonder, when we think about these shared physical print models, we can look to models like Amazon and begin to have moving collections, and we can anticipate needs and move collections in a more shared way. Maybe that's way out there, but it's something that we can think about. So my final slide is that it is possible, it's very possible, that a lot of these efforts, these shared print efforts, are really just about capturing the scholarship, the scientific and cultural heritage of our country, which I think libraries of our world, I think that's one of the highest priorities that we have. But I will say, because I'm not that much of a naysayer, that I've got a book on my desk that I keep that's about collective collections, and it's dated from 1985. And the reason I keep it on my desk is it makes me think that it's been 30 years since that book, over 30 years since that book was written, and because of the efforts like East Project, like the Huddy Trust Project, like a lot of the other shared print projects, and where we're asking these really difficult questions, we're going to be able to get from this chaotic world of this Pollock with ideas going all over and not being sure how really to bring it together, to a point where we'll begin to see some structure and we'll begin to see something. And if you guys see it and I'm missing it, I welcome you in the last few minutes to ask a question or share that with me. But for me, there's still a bunch of questions, so thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, everybody. Well, I'm realizing that we're a couple minutes over time, but those of us on the panel are glad to stay for a few minutes if there are any questions. We understand if people need to get to other places, however. Are there questions from the audience? You all want your afternoon break. I get that. Okay, well, thank you so much for your attention. We appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of the conference.